Good morning. It's time for Public Perspective on Classic 103. I'm your host, John Maguire, and today I'll be joined by Gil Belles from the McDonough County Historical Society to talk about cemetery restoration in McDonough County and a project that he's been working with for some time now. So stay tuned to Classic 103 for Public Perspective. Welcome back to Public Perspective on Classic 103. I'm your host, John Maguire, and today's guest is Gil Belles, and who's going to be discussing some of the efforts that are underway to restore McDonough County cemeteries. Good morning, Gil.
Well, good morning, John, and thanks for inviting me.
I'm glad you could come. I, of course, had an occasion to hear some of this at a Rotary meeting not too long ago, and it was fascinating, and I thought it would be a great topic to share with our listeners. So how did the interest in McDonough County cemeteries kind of take place for you, and how did this project get started?
Well, it took place for me when I became president of the McDonough County Historical Society, but the roots of the project go back a lot further. A member of the McDonough County Genealogical Society, Dwayne Lester, back in the 1970s, decided to try and identify every person buried in every cemetery in our county. Mm-hmm. And that's a rather daunting proposal when you realize that he and Libby Grimm and Marge Harris identified 127 cemeteries in our county. Now, some of those, even by the 1970s, had been totally abandoned and destroyed and unidentified as cemeteries. But they knew people had been buried there from obituaries and family accounts and diaries. So they put it on the record that at some point there were burials there, but they couldn't identify the site in terms of a monument or a marker or a stone. But those people, Dwayne Lester and Libby Grimm and Marge Harris, did most of the real hard legwork in terms of where these cemeteries are located and who is resting in those cemeteries. In 2003, a few people of the then current Historical Society decided to start marking with nice new signs on the county cemeteries. And the first two they did were Camp Creek Cemetery between here and Industry, still an active cemetery, very well taken care of, a very nice informational booth with the location of all of the monuments and people there, and the old Macomb Cemetery, which is on Wigwam Hollow Road. Those were the first two signs placed in 2003.
And Wigwam Hollow Road and Adams Street.
Yeah, just north of Adams Street,
right.
On the west side of the road as you go up the hill after you've, well, either going south
True.
Or north. There's
True.
a hill. At the top of the hill on the west side is the cemetery.
Okay, yeah. That one's fairly well visible to people, even though not burial site on a frequent basis, if anything, in the last 10, 20 years.
Oh, it hasn't been used for a decade, century. Yeah,
Wow.
The last burials there were a long time ago. And the tragedy, in my view, and that's an interesting one to talk about for a few minutes, is that it has been neglected. The city still mows the lawn, but I would estimate that 70% of the headstones have fallen down and they're lying flat and they're getting buried under with sod and grass. And it's a tragedy because these headstones represent the closest thing we have to original artifacts of the 1830s and 1840s, because the architect or the engraver of those headstones, John Long, J.L., put his initials on a lot of the epitaphs and engravings and elaborate carvings that he put into those, and they're down laying in the mud. And it's just a tragedy because as you from your travels and most people that are listening know, you go to a city, Boston, or New Orleans, Philadelphia, and their historic cemeteries are a big draw.
Right.
And we have some of our forebears in that cemetery, as well as this artwork, as well as the history of people who lived before us in there. And it's just kind of deteriorating, and it's too bad. I'm trying to encourage service clubs and scout groups or other people who want to take the time just to go in and lift up those stones and set them up so they're upright and clean the surface so people can read them and enjoy the serene walk through this really beautiful setting. It's a nice high spot. You can look all over the place from up there and begin to appreciate the history of our community that dates back to 1830.
Well, and that task of lifting stones and cleaning them probably takes more physical labor than anything else.
This is true, and the stones in that particular cemetery are not the great, big, huge, massive ones that you might characterize in Oakwood, where they're 8
Right.
feet tall and they're 2 feet wide and a foot deep. These are pretty much the old flat stone types that are just easily fallen and very easily lifted up.
Right.
It takes some spade work, some shovels, some poking around. We've had that happen with the old Catholic cemetery on a Quail Walk Road. A volunteer group came into town and asked for a project, and I said, well, let's spend 2 hours out there. And we made grids out of what you call caution tape or police
Right.
yellow tape.
Right.
We made great big 12-foot grids, and each grid had 2 volunteers go through it with a poker, a rod, a stick, something with a point on it to poke around. And we uncovered about 8 stones that had been totally buried. And we lifted them up and we put them alongside of Quail Walk Road so people could actually see that it was a cemetery. And there's probably a dozen stones now along that fence line. And we felt that that was better than allowing them to continue to deteriorate and get lost. And that's another really interesting old cemetery. That's where St. Paul Church used to have all of its people buried until it became impassable in the winter or big rainstorms.
Right.
Consider no paved roads, wooden rut
Sure.
wagons trying to get from downtown Macomb out to there. It was impossible. So some donors provided the new land for the new St. Paul Cemetery at the top of Lafayette. And a lot of the people who had been buried in the old Catholic cemetery were moved.
Reinterred.
But
Right.
if you couldn't find a relative to get permission, or permission was denied,
Understood.
the person's remains stayed there. But the records aren't very well kept in terms of who's there, who was moved. And so what we do
Wow.
have are a handful of the monuments just kind of scattered around and lying underground. Well, we tried to recover 6 or 7 of those that day, which was quite a thrill for the kids. These were all high school age kids, and they just got a big kick out of finding one of these and digging it up and resetting it, and it was a delight. And then they learned a lot about a cemetery and what it can tell people. It's the dates on the tombstones, whether they were infants, whether they were really elderly people, what the family connections were, the family names. There is a person in that cemetery by the last name of McDonough, but it's not a relative of our Colonel or General McDonough or Commodore,
Right.
whatever he
Commodore.
was.
Civil.
That the county's named after.
Sort of War of 1812 fame.
1812, but it shows you that we did have a descendant of some sort of a McDonough, and that's one of the very legible headstones out there.
When a stone has been covered with the earth for such a period of time, what are the chances that it's in relatively good shape underneath?
Well, there's 2 outcomes. One of is the yaha moment when you realize that covering of dirt and sod has actually protected the engraving
Right.
instead of the wind erosion that's more frequent when they are standing up facing west. And the wind and the air pollution has destroyed a lot of the legibility of those stones. Sometimes if it's lying under a couple of inches of dirt and sod, it's very legible, and it doesn't take much to whisk broom and clean those off so that they're legible. Sometimes if they're face down, it's even better because they haven't had any chance to be ruined that way. The tragedy is, though, if they were knocked over by a cow or a deer or a vandal, it could break. These are not very thick, and they're
Right.
not made out of granite or marble. And sometimes when you attempt to uncover and lift one up, you find that it's got a breakage or 2. Now, a couple of the monument people in town know how to repair that. They know how to put those back together, but it's a pricey situation, and it's difficult. It's a 2-part epoxy deal.
Right.
So you can restore them in some sense. And what they've done out at the Atkinson Cemetery out at Argyle, they have built specific bases for these old stones that it's kind of like a slot. It's a cement base with a specific trench or slot in it, and then you can set the headstone into that slot for a much more permanent position for it
Right.
to preserve it. So there's a lot of ways to reclaim a cemetery.
Well, it's intricate that there would be so many ways, and we've only touched base on a couple of cemeteries so far. I'll be honest, being a longtime Macomb person, like since I was born, I was not aware of the Catholic cemetery at Quail Walk Road. I was certainly aware of the one on Lafayette. You talked about 127 cemeteries. Oh, what constitutes a cemetery?
I'm glad you asked that, John, because when then the Historical Society brought this project back to the surface in 2007, that was one of the first things I had to do for myself. They said, okay, we're going to start putting signs on our cemeteries. Well, I looked through this book of 127 listed, documented, mapped cemeteries from Dwayne Lester and Libby Grimm, and I thought, now, looking through there are categories, in my view. A cemetery is a plot that has more than a family or a couple of people. Now, a family cemetery is a cemetery if it's got, more than one person in it.
Right.
But if there's just one burial, then I call that a grave site.
Okay.
And that's the way I've even put it on our signs. We have marked 2 grave sites in our county, but I won't stretch that to cemetery unless there were a handful of people there.
Right.
And a cemetery can come in a lot of different, what I would call denominations. It can be a religious cemetery sponsored by a church, like the St. Paul Cemetery, 2 of them here in town, plus the one out at Tennessee, the Sacred
Right.
Heart. That's under the auspices now of the local Catholic Church because of the closing of the Tennessee Catholic Church.
Right.
It's abandoned, but it's not neglected. It's taken care of in the same way that Old Catholic on Quail Walk is. Bernie Lewis takes care of those 2 cemeteries. And the church takes care of the newer one up on Lafayette. Well, if you have a church there, sometimes you have a family cemetery, which is exclusive to a particular family. The Rigg family south of here, cemetery with about 15 headstones, all Riggs. And Craig and his brother take care of that cemetery. It's no longer active. It's inactive,
Okay.
but it's not abandoned or neglected. So the family can have a cemetery. A community can have a cemetery, a city cemetery like Oakwood in Macomb, like Bardolph in Bardolph, Prairie City, Industry. You can have a municipal cemetery.
Right.
You can have a really large community cemetery like the Harris Cemetery over at on the eastern border of our county, which is run by a board of trustees. It's still very active. It's still a huge cemetery. But it has the label cemetery because it has a large number of people, and some of these are still very active. Some of them are supported by private trust, or they're supported by city revenue. And those are kind of the ways I define cemetery. So other than the single monument types, which are grave sites, just about anything else that has 2 or 3 or 4 burials there, I'm calling a cemetery.
Right. And with more than 100, how do you go about systematically, let's say, exploring those sites? Or have you explored all 127 sites? Or has somebody explored them all?
Well, I wouldn't call my approach systematic.
Okay.
The first one I put put a sign up was the Bardolph Cemetery, simply because I would bicycle by it on
Right.
3 times a week, and I'd see what a beautiful, maintained, and a very historic old cemetery. But there was absolutely no signage. So that was my first criteria when I got started. The cemetery had to be accessible to people. It had to have no sign, because
Right.
we were going to provide and support the sign. I saw no utility in duplicating signage if
Right.
a cemetery already had a pretty nice identifying entryway or a sign.
What sample might you give of a cemetery that has such an identifier, like Oakwood, obviously, in Macomb?
Well, yeah,
or
Pennington Point
Pennington
has a
Point.
beautiful arch with its sign.
Harris?
Harris has no. Harris did not have
Harris
a sign.
did not have a sign.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it varied, and I'll tell you, to be honest with you, the first batch that I was doing the first 2 years were accessible to me simply because I could get to them easily and find
Right.
them. Then the mystery grew as I'd get further beyond that radius and find on the map there was supposed to be a cemetery in the southwest quarter of Section 17 in Bethel Township, and then I would try to find that, and if I get off my bike or out of my car, I start knocking on doors, and oh yeah, there's a cemetery back there. I can get in my truck. I'll take you back to it. Well, finding those was kind of a gem until I discovered a lot of those by being abandoned are in pretty bad shape because trees and animals have pretty much knocked the things down. The most recent discovery was one that will mark the King Cemetery in the western part of the county. It's a huge cemetery, covers over an acre of land, has over 100 burials, and these are massive, great, big, beautiful monuments. But a tornado came through about 15 years ago, and the huge trees, big trees, fell down all over the monuments. So now this would require hydraulic equipment,
Wow.
what do you call them, backhoe or a lifter or something, to get those up and back on their bases because they're just huge. But it would be a beautiful cemetery if it ever got reclaimed and restored in that way. And we're putting signs on some of those simply because so they don't get worse, they don't deteriorate further. When you have a shifting population, sometimes a new property owner will inherit land and he didn't quite know there was a cemetery on
Right.
it, doesn't quite like the idea, might tend to kind of chip away at 6 inches a year
Yeah.
to get rid of that eyesore or that lack
Yeah.
of crop part of his farm. So all of these things become issues with me because I get so excited about,
Right.
about trying to preserve the cemeteries that we do have. We have put signs on 75.
Wow.
And I'm assessing that we've got at least 35 more. I think we've got 110 that we could actually call cemeteries that could be identified as such. And over the next summer or two, I hope we can finish off. And well, it means me finding them too. The reason there's 35 left is because I haven't been able to actually see them. I need
Physically
to see,
locate.
I need to see it before I can buy a sign for it
Right.
to make sure it's there. And I have to research what year we find the first burial, see if there's any veterans of the Revolutionary, 1812 or Civil War buried there, find out a little bit about the history of the people who are resting there. And all of those things have become the fascinating enthusiasm that I find by getting involved in these.
Let's take a little history approach. What would be the cemetery that has the oldest burial in it, approximately, or of those you found,
No,
or
that's-
Civil War,
Well, all of our
Revolutionary War?
cemeteries didn't exist until at least 1830 when
Okay.
people started to populate the area. And we do have several. Each one has claimed in its own to be the first one,
Right.
but each one has maybe a burial that's identified by the headstone of 1830. So that's really the oldest that we
1830s.
have in our county that so far that I've dated in terms of signage. And then they go from there. And an 1830 to an 1860 cemetery could have a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And we have at least 3 actual veterans and a couple of people who lived at the time of the Revolution in our local cemeteries. In fact, I got an email just the other day from an out-of-state person who visited the Liberty Cemetery, which is up in the far northwest corner up in Blandesville County. And the Civil War veteran by the last name of Revolutionary War veteran by the last name of Vance, she wanted to point out that his headstone is leaning, and she was afraid it would fall down.
Wow.
Well, I personally can't do very much about that, but Blandesville does have 7 cemeteries in their township,
Wow.
and they have assessed, long time ago, they assessed a very modest fraction of a cent levy for the
Right.
township, specifically to take care of and mow their 7 cemeteries, even though only one of those cemeteries is active. The other 6 are inactive, but they're very well taken care of by this modest, tiny little fraction to pay a retired person his gasoline and labor to keep them mowed. Well, anyway, I sent that information on to their cemetery committee. Maybe they can get that Revolutionary War veteran out. But we've got A lot of Civil War veterans in our county, all over. A lot of these cemeteries have Civil War veterans in them, and then of course every war after that's very well represented.
The Blandesville Township people probably deserve some kudos for having the foresight to create a mechanism to fund and maintain
Yeah.
these sites.
Walnut Grove did the same thing
Walnut
at
Grove.
Township because they've got 6 cemeteries and they take care of all 6 of those, even though some of them are very obscure, hard to get to, inaccessible, and they're all inactive, but they still take care of them.
Well, and that accounts for maybe a modest share of the more than 100 you identified. Who is responsible or who takes ownership of some of the maintenance of these areas?
That's a problem, John, because some of them, and the reason they are abandoned and neglected is because nobody has taken responsibility. If all the descendants of all of the people who might be in a cemetery move away, it falls onto the shoulders of maybe a local property owner. And this is heartening because there's about 4 or 5 cemeteries in our county that have been, the care of which has been assumed by just a local person near it because they're living across the road from it or they live next door to it. And they take care of it just out of the tender, loving appreciation of having it nearby. Sometimes it's not even on their land, but they still take care of it. One person in the community found out that the county still owned one cemetery called Foster's Point Cemetery,
Okay.
and it was being taken care of by a volunteer local farm neighbor. When he died, the county really didn't want to even deal with that anymore, and so she bought the cemetery for $1 from the county, and now she and her family take care of it, and it's in beautiful shape, and it has a Revolutionary War veteran in it, Foster's Point Cemetery. And there's a cemetery in one of the fringe parts of Industry, the neighbor across the road, Tim Eifert. He takes care of that cemetery just because he loves it. And he's volunteered just recently. He offered me the volunteer to help do some more in the county
Right.
next summer. So, this is kind of contagious when you get excited about this and you want to do something about it. You find people that are willing, as you're probably going to ask me about the Boy Scouts.
I will.
I definitely want to get a plug in for Eagle Scout projects because that's how we've restored 5 or 6 now.
Well, and I think that when you have the opportunity, whether it's in the format of this program or whether you have the opportunity to talk to a civic organization, getting that information out there is just helpful.
Oh, yeah.
And if we can do that today, I'm fascinated by the fact that there are so many of these cemeteries in so many locations, but there's probably some probability that there are some out there that nobody's recorded yet.
Oh, I'm sure there are. I mean, I give all kinds of credit to Dwayne Lester and
You
Libby
should,
Grimm
yes.
for their undaunted effort to try and going through obituaries and letters and diaries in the genealogy site to identify where people were buried over the last century. It was just astronomically hard. Difficult, but like you're saying, there could be individual grave sites where somebody
Yeah.
just died on a farm and they buried him without anybody recording that. Family knew about it. They had a service and they didn't have the money to put a monument. There's probably quite a few of those around.
Well, and what number of the cemeteries you've been looking at over the course of the project are actually active cemeteries versus majority, I'm sure, are inactive?
Well, that can vary. When I found one cemetery or marked one cemetery, I thought it was inactive.
Right.
And the people that helped me put together the date and the data from it said, well, nobody's been buried here in 30-some years. So
Right.
to me, that's kind of inactive.
Yes.
But about 2 months ago, I read an obituary, and the person was going to be buried in that cemetery. So they got permission to make it active again. And it doesn't take much. You just go to a funeral director and say, could I have my so-and-so relative or could I have myself buried in the XYZ cemetery? And they do the paperwork to get it approved, and they do it. So what you and I might consider an inactive cemetery today, by next week somebody could be buried there, and so it's active again. And they're not very well maintained that way, because the three cemeteries I'm thinking about, only two of them are mowed and taken over. A trust fund takes care of it.
Right.
The other one is what I'd call an old family cemetery that, in many respects, is pretty well neglected. But here, the person wanted to be buried there, so they did. So I'm sure the family cleaned it up a bit before the service.
Well, and perhaps that serves a very useful purpose. And it was one of the questions I was going to explore is how do you make a cemetery active when it's not? And apparently it's a matter of choice.
Yes, it is. A cemetery becomes inactive by default. It just, nobody's taking care of it, and nobody's being buried in it. And that's the way it becomes inactive. Nobody actually goes in and certifies or documents that this cemetery is inactive. It's just by
virtue of neglect.
Yeah, there you go. Neglect and attention, and nobody wanting to be buried there. If
True.
somebody still wanted to be buried in the old Catholic cemetery on Quail Walk Road, they could ask a funeral director to do that, and they could do this. So all of a sudden, after 150 or 200 years, it's active again
Right.
to that degree. Then
Assuming they could document a location within there and have appropriate deed or whatever
Right.
anymore.
Yeah.
Today's very regulated society. It's time for us to take a break, but we'll be right back with more public perspective on Classic 103.